right, so it's 2:45, so I think we can get started. Welcome everyone to the 4-Point Channel in Moakley Park virtual tour. I hope you've been having a great time today. I'm Lily Chin-Martin, the Development Coordinator at Boston Harbor Now. Just before we get started, I wanted to give you all a quick kind of intro into how this meeting is different. Our panels, sorry, I'm admitting people at the same time. Our panels today have all been on Zoom webinar. This is a Zoom meeting, so you have the option to have your video on and your audio on. So if you want to change those settings, that's in the bottom left-hand corner. Also, please keep in mind that we're recording this session, and you can change your the way you view Zoom to in the upper right-hand corner. Gallery view or speaker view if you want to be able to see everyone's video, or if you just want to see who's presenting. I do want to let everyone know that we're going to be ending this tour, 10 minutes earlier than originally scheduled. The formal memorial services for George Floyd are happening today in Minneapolis, and the NAACP is holding an 8-minute and 46-second moment of silence in honor of George Floyd at 3:45, so we want to give everyone the opportunity to participate in that. So today's tour of the 4-Point Channel in Moakley Park will be led by Amy Whitesides, the studio director at Stoss Landscape Urbanism. Before I turn it over to her, I have a quick video that will show us some of the sections that we could have been seeing if the circumstances were different. So I'm going to get that video up. Great, so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Amy.
Okay, great. Can you all see my screen and hear me? Looks good. I'm getting a thumbs up from Julie. Good. Okay, so as Lily mentioned, we are going to take a little tour today of 4-Point Channel, Moakley Park, brief little visit to underneath Moakley Park, and Morrissey Boulevard, and a little beyond Morrissey Boulevard. We'll do that. We have a great group of tour guides today. I'm Amy Whitesides. I'm the studio director at Stoss Landscape Urbanism. We are a landscape and urban design studio here in Boston and with offices in Los Angeles. And I'm joined today by Julie Eaton Ernst, who is engineer with Weston and Sampson, and by Peyton Jones, who is the Climate Ready Boston coordinator at the City of Boston, and by Carly Foster, who is with Arcadis. We'll start out with, I'll talk a bit about Moakley Park with Julie, and then we'll have a brief period for question and answer. And then we'll turn it over to Carly and Peyton to talk about some of the areas that also influence some of the issues we're going to talk about relative to Moakley, and we'll have another second period of Q&A. And then we'll wrap up a bit early. So we'll try and get through this pretty quickly. So first, just a quick kind of raise of hands. Have you been to Moakley Park before? Was this going to be your debut in the park? So we got a few people who have, so kind of a mix, a lot of people who haven't been there before. Great. Glad to see this will be, some of this will be new. I'm sorry we were not able to actually be in the park today. So first off, why are we talking about Moakley Park, and why are we talking about it in the context of Fort Point and Morrissey Boulevard in Dorchester? And these three areas, one of the big reasons for this has to do with flood risk in the city of Boston. So these three areas together make up flood pathways that kind of join together and create this really large area of flooding that you can see that with 40 inches of sea level rise, we have risk to areas of South Boston, the South End, Roxbury, and Dorchester. So together, these make this really important kind of piece of protecting the city of Boston from future coastal flooding. And also, I think one of the more important aspects of this is that Moakley Park in particular is situated in the middle of a community which is defined as an environmental justice community. So you can see what that means is really that these populations directly adjacent to the park and even sort of within this 1 mile radius are at extra risk kind of from social vulnerability of the effects of coastal flooding. So, and that's largely due to them being either a combination of either minority, low income, or English isolation communities, or a combination of all of the above. So the two communities directly adjacent to Moakley Park fall into that, that last category, which is really important when we think about coastal flooding and the potential impacts it has on people. In addition to this, the population surrounding Moakley Park is projected to double in the coming years as a result of a number of projects that are coming on board. So what this means is that then the park itself becomes a really important kind of future open space for all of these different populations, not only the existing population that doesn't necessarily have access to great parks, but then this increased density, which will need really great space to go to. So I'm going to launch right in talking about Moakley, and then I'll turn it over to Julie in just a little bit. Moakley and actually the surrounding areas really are a few themes become really super important when we're talking about Moakley Park. Resiliency is, of course, as I started out with in showing the kind of why talk about these three together, resiliency is key. Here we see areas, this isn't Moakley Park itself, but just south, flooded in the 2018 storms, and tremendous risk in the area. Equity is a really important factor, as we're looking at why are we focused on Moakley as an important first step in the city of Boston's kind of coastal flood prevention planning. And part of that has to do with those neighborhoods that I just showed you and the need for an equitable distribution of protection. In addition to that, Moakley Park is really about family and play. It's really a place for communities to come together and to celebrate and have a place to be with one another and get to know each other. It's about community health. Many of these neighborhoods don't necessarily have a place to engage in fitness and experience the benefits of parks or experience have the ability to go to the gym or do other things that a park can kind of offer for them. And then lastly, it is today and will continue to be an important space for athletics and sports, and especially for a lot of the youth groups that in the city are, provide tremendous services for kids to kind of learn and grow through athletics. So again, why Moakley? Moakley Park is one of Boston's largest parks, and it's Boston's really only large waterfront park. It's also part of the missing link in the Emerald Necklace. So connected up with Columbia Road, it really links into Franklin Park and becomes the connector between Franklin Park and the South Boston kind of promenade and Castle Island. It's also easily accessible by public transportation, which is not true of many of Boston's larger parks. You can see here this image, Moakley is in the foreground here, and we have JFK Station just behind it and the red line coming in on the right-hand side. So it's, the red line is right there in a couple places, but at the same time, as you could actually see from that last image, while JFK Station is right there, walking from JFK Station up to Moakley Park is a relatively daunting thing to do. You have to come through K Circle, which is kind of messy, and any form of transportation you might try to go through. So in addition to that, Moakley Park is isolated really on either side of it by these 4-lane and 6-lane roadways. So it's isolated from the Mary Ellen McCormick houses, which are right here to the left in this image, or to the west. And it's isolated from the beach, which is right next to it, but is difficult to know that you're right there at Moakley Park. And as I just mentioned, there are a few places within the park where you can see that you're right there at the park and that you're really kind of in this gateway to the harbor. But through the majority of the park, shown in red here, you really can't see the beach, and you wouldn't really know that you're right there. So this tremendous asset that the park is kind of goes missing. Historically, Moakley was a salt marsh and a salt marsh and a mudflat. And then in the early 1900s, it was turned into a dump and then a playground, which is generally an inadvisable sequencing of your open spaces. And then it was filled with clay and then capped with soil for the ball fields, and then eventually for the beach. What this means is that you can see today in this image, just shortly after Moakley was completed, you can kind of see the remnant of that history, and right here where it's sort of the last area to get filled in. It means that Moakley today is subject to flooding, both kind of from high groundwater, which Julie will speak to, as well as from just stormwater. When it rains, the fields that are there flood pretty regularly. And that leads us to it leads to basically a diminishing return on the program that is existing in Moakley Park. So right now, about 55% of the park is covered in sports fields, and those fields are rendered unusable when it rains. And they're flooded. At the same time, that leaves about 43% of the park unprogrammed, really. So it's sort of space in between these fields. It's generally some lawn and some trees, and it goes sort of unused by the community. And it's really this set of conditions that led to the city of Boston in 2019 coming out with this vision for Moakley Park. So our office, in combination with One Architecture and Urbanism from New York and Niche Engineering, worked on this vision, which was, the idea was to really create a concept for the park that would help to alleviate a number of these issues that I've just outlined. It would make it more accessible, make it more inclusive, continue to improve and advance the quality of the athletic fields that are on site, and have the park act as protection against this coastal flooding that I've illustrated up front. And as well to manage some of the stormwater and generally sort of improve the overall conditions of the park. So this is an image of the vision plan, which was this image was part of sort of the end of, or early 2019, sorry, we wrapped up this part of the project and put forward this plan. And we've been discussing this plan with a number of community groups. We've held a number of events in the park. We've spoken with the groups everywhere from the seniors groups in Boston to attending street fairs and festivals that are existing. This is the South Boston Street Fair. We held some, like a little marshmallow roast in the park. And through that work, we've reached about 56 different zip codes, largely South Boston focused, but kind of in and around the city. And what we've heard really, also we had a lot of fun talking to kids about what they might want to see in the park. Some really great thinking here. Some of them had, very clear ideas of where you enter and where you exit and the various games and things you might see, even thinking about restrooms, which was a key desire from many people, to one kid thinking about where do their parents go when they're bored waiting for their kids to play. So we really have had some great input from the kids in the neighborhood who really who use the park today and hopefully will use it throughout their lives. What that led to was the creation of this vision plan that I showed you a minute ago. And here in plan you can see this dashed red line is this line of higher elevation where we're seeking to prevent the coastal flooding, kind of implement a kind of berm, like a landscaped berm that's really integrated into the park and, doesn't feel so much like a wall, but really starts to just be a place for new types of things to happen. And in the meantime, it can connect up to areas in South Boston and areas we'll hear about in a minute from Peyton, just south in Dorchester, that are raised and working to act as the protection for the city. This was a kind of an early idea of what that berm might look like. So you can see it here sort of acting as, a point of observation for the water, as well as a kind of area of picnicking and things just in its own right. And really, acting then when it's flooding, you can see, the water sort of coming in and being held back by that berm in a 40 inches of sea level rise on a 1% storm, which we believe to be about 2070 timeline. And as I mentioned, we envisioned that berm then acting really as a great kind of program element as well. So here you can see it really acting as a place for spectators to observe some of the sporting events that might be happening, and then in winter functioning as a sledding hill. And then again, at the top of the berm, really being able to look out and see the harbor, really making Moakley really function as this gateway to the harbor. You can see here again in front of this, we're sort of standing up on the top of the berm in this image and looking out over this waterfront plaza where things like events and food trucks and various things might happen. Really critical here is making that connection over to Carson Beach so people can move smoothly between the two. And then, we're looking at implementing other forms of sport courts and that kind of thing, which not only serve as activation for different kinds of program, but could also work as flood protection from stormwater. So when it rains, these might fill up and hold excess stormwater. So all of this was a really kind of the various sort of views, a quick look basically into the vision plan, which was wrapped up. And since we since we worked on the vision plan, we have been now working over about the past year with Weston and Sampson and a whole host of other engineers and designers on a refinement of this vision plan. And so I'm going to turn it over to Julie to tell you a little bit about some of the technical work that we've been doing to get more information. Much of this vision plan was done just with community input as to what they would like to have and see in the park, but without a lot of the below ground technical information that we might need to help us really adequately locate things. So I'll give it over to Julie.
Thanks, Amy. Hi everyone, I'm Julie Eaton-Ernst with Weston and Sampson. I've had the privilege of working with STOF for the last year on this incredible park. And so we'll talk a little bit about some of the technical considerations that have gone into the redeveloping, redesigning, advancing of this vision. So whenever we're looking at our future climate, we also like to look back to really see how climate has shaped our landscape to date. So we're going to start way back when, in elementary school, you guys learned about how we were all Pangea and the world formed and spread across. So that's sort of our pre-glacial geology, sort of thinking about where land masses moved. Then we know that the glaciers came, and we knew the glaciers were in the Boston area, and when they left behind soil debris of, sand, really compacted sand, gravel, and then finally finally deposited, clay came in. So we hear often in Boston of our Boston blue clay. So that formed in our harbor. And then as the glaciers melted, sea levels rose, and then we ended up with our hills being the Boston Barrier Islands, and the harbor being what we know it today. As Amy was mentioning, the area used to be a salt marsh and a mud flat, and it was filled in. So during that time of fill in the early 1900s, it's then been known as a park. It used to be Columbus Park, and it was renamed to Joe Moakley Park in 2001. And that's sort of how we've known the park today. So we have a great idea of what we think we're going to find on this site. We think we're going to be looking for fill materials. We know that some of it was dredged clay from the harbor. Some of it was fill from the landfill. We think because it was that mud flat, we might see organics. We're expecting to see Boston blue clay. And we're looking really for bedrock and what the quality consistency of these materials are. So we did a subsurface exploration program, which helped us to get little snapshots through a very large park, 62 acres, get a few snapshots through the park of what's below ground surface. So I'm going to ask you guys now to use your chat. And I'm curious, what do you think, how deep do you think bedrock is at Moakley Park? You guys can just chat to everyone in the chat box if you have a guess. Was it 20 feet below ground surface, 40 feet, 100 feet, 400 feet? We didn't know either, which is why we did our subsurface exploration program. Okay, we have some good guesses. We've got 20 feet, 28 feet, 70 feet, 60 feet. Any last takers? Got a 50 feet, 100 feet. All right. Well, when we did our subsurface explorations, we found that the bedrock really varied. We saw it on the north part of the site at 67 feet, but then in the center of the site, it was over 200 feet. 224 feet was when we encountered bedrock. And then by where the stadium is, it was at 200 feet where we saw bedrock. So that was really surprising for us to sort of see that how deep the bedrock is at this site. And then we also learned a lot about the fill quality, consistency. The fill was really thick on the site, which is understandable considering that it used to be part of the harbor. So we saw it between 12 and 22 feet. We saw some pretty shallow groundwater as well. And we did a series of borings, installed some wells and probes and test pits that helped us learn a little bit more about the site and what that means as we advance design. So the other thing we're looking for is below ground are utilities, knowing that Boston's already been developed. So when we looked at the utilities and easements, we're showing here on this plan the original alignment of that barrier, the red dotted line that you saw on that previous image Amy showed. And what we learned was that the MWRA and Boston Water and Sewer infrastructure is currently operational and really critical to maintaining services, wastewater and stormwater services for the city of Boston. And that there were certain areas that they really needed for access for operations and maintenance. So in having these sort of investigations and understanding the utilities and what the service needs are, we were actually able to rethink how this alignment could shift back into the park and create other opportunities and actually create more of a landscape between the barrier and the waterfront that allows for more of that open space and connection to the waterfront as well. So that was an opportunity that was realized. We also looked at sort of what this barrier would look like. So the original plan was to think about doing a typical earthen levee, which may have a clay core with slopes, and it looked like it was going to be about 100 feet wide with the footprint. What we realized was that by having it be entirely earthen construction, for it to go through the FEMA accreditation and Army Corps process, we couldn't have trees within 20 feet of that slope. So we would end up with these massive areas where there would be no trees. So we started working with structural and geotechnical teams on, can we allow trees on the barrier? And we came up with the concept of a core wall, where the wall itself buried in the embankment is what's providing the flood protection. And then we can't have any trees within 20 feet of that wall, but it allows it to become a more vegetated slope. And also really thinking about what are the opportunities with this wall and how the earth and form is no longer responsible for flood protection. So it can really start to take some programmatic functions and shapes. And I'll have Amy talk a little bit to some of those concepts of how we played around with the wall.
Great. So what that means is, this is kind of the form of that original earthen berm and the type of program we were looking at, for the most part, adjacent to it, where we have sort of low slopes, things where we can have spectators sitting and watching, but largely it's not that diverse in terms of what can happen along that berm. Here with this new wall concept, which you can see here in the middle, we can still have that same kind of shape we had before, but we also can start to build in different types of adjacent relationships. So here we've got that berm relationship on one side, but then we might have, a set of stairs, and those could be standard steps that allow someone to go down, or those could be more like a kind of stadium seating type thing that allows us to create an amphitheater. A place to sit and watch the water. Or in some places, we may even let the wall kind of peak up and express itself and become part of a seating element, either just the wall itself or something that kind of gets built onto that wall to create, a design element that both is acting as flood protection, but is also starting to let people engage with the park in new ways.
I'll just add, the benefit also of the wall is that we can design it to be added to in the future. So it allows us flexibility if needed to be able to raise the wall and sort of if we need additional height and protection in the future. And that's sort of a benefit that we see as well in having that structural element. The other things we've talked about, sort of the barrier being in coastal defenses, but we're also considering, the stormwater, groundwater, and heat implications on the site. So as Amy mentioned, the park is wet in areas where there's high groundwater and where stormwater has trouble draining. So really working with niche engineering on selection of green infrastructure strategies to do creative stormwater management on the site, and also creating that tree canopy that will really mitigate the urban heat island effects and have a lot of improved air quality and just overall quality of life.
Great. So we are really excited to get to reveal to you a lot of the new design for the park, the sort of updated design that accommodates all of this new information we've been learning, as well as all the great feedback we've gotten from the community over the past year. But we can't do it yet. We're going through sort of final design in the next month or so of this stage, and then it'll go through some review, and hopefully in August or September of this year, we'll be able to have an open house. We hope that open house can be in person in some way, to be determined as we see how things go. But we really look forward to sharing more with you all at that time and getting your input on all the great changes that have happened in the park. And then we're also looking to continue working and starting to focus in on a phase 1 that will hopefully begin design on right after that open house time. So with that, I want to open it up for just a few minutes, maybe 5 minutes or so of questions from any of you. I know we have some Moakley Park experts in the crowd, I noticed, so no tough questions, please. But we're happy to answer any questions you might have for the time. About the design, about the park, whatever you might be interested in. Just, I think probably chat is the best way to do that. Yeah, Lily? So just drop your question in the chat box if you've got one. Looks like we might be fresh out. Okay, great. So how is transportation, this is from Lucy, how is transportation, walking / biking connection being addressed with Columbia Ave? It's a great question. We are definitely, there is a lot of transportation thinking going on in this area because there's so many different projects that are happening. I didn't talk at length in these, Peyton might address these quickly. Right next to the park, Mary Ellen McCormick is changing, Bayside is changing. There's a lot of thinking going in with MassDOT and the city looking at these things. So outside the park, we are working with all those agencies to talk about how does all that thinking kind of link up with the park. At the same time, within the park, we are adding things like bike lanes and pedestrian promenades that make it really easy to get through the park and connect from one end to the other. And then somewhat similar to that question, I think that there's a question about Day Boulevard and someone mentioning that they saw that, very astutely saw that Day Boulevard was closed off and whether or not we're incorporating it into the park. And I think importantly, with the question above, it's really important. We really envision a day where perhaps Day Boulevard doesn't function as a road all the time. Day Boulevard is subject to coastal flooding in the future. And so at some point, its capacity as a road will decline. And it's a very, currently a really dangerous road that cuts people off from the beach. So the Parks Department, who we're working with, doesn't own that road. So it's not really, they can't make those decisions in this context, but we are working with MassDOT, working with many of the other constituents who are involved in the projects adjacent to understand the future potential of Day Boulevard and whether it may, during some key times kind of function more as a pedestrian walkway and kind of a promenade that connects the park and the beach together. Okay, I think I don't see any more questions, and I know we're a little short on time since we're going to end early, so I'll switch it over to Carly Carly will share her screen, and she and Peyton will run you through some information about Morrissey Ave and Fort Point and how they connect up with this Moakley Park work.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to move the Zoom away from. There we go. I'll pass it over to Peyton now.
Great. Thanks, everyone. So hi, everybody. I'm Peyton. I work for the City of Boston's Climate Ready team. And I'm going to speak super briefly to how our Climate Ready Boston Dorchester Coastal Resilience Planning ties into this Moakley Park work that we're discussing. Next slide. So like all of our neighborhood coastal resilience plans, the Climate Ready Dorchester plan looks really carefully at the timing and location of the flood pathways into the neighborhood and works with communities to identify design solutions to protect the neighborhood from that coastal flooding, both sea level rise, storm surge, and also the wave action and erosion. Next slide. So in addition to the really critically important and central resilience goals, we're also thinking about other citywide goals. So how do we enhance access to mobility, promote health of ecosystems in the neighborhood, and really define the identity of the coastline through the neighborhood. We've come to think of this as the Dorchester Shoreway. Next slide. So you can see here the project area as a whole, obviously the entire neighborhood. And then on the east side, you can kind of see where we expect to see flooding over time. So where we see flooding today and where we expect to see flooding in 2070. Next slide. So as Amy mentioned, one of the key flood inundation pathways into the neighborhood is right along the southern edge of the Moakley Park project. So we called it the Bayside Pathway. And another critical flood pathway into the neighborhood is the North Morrissey pathway. So I'm going to briefly touch on our proposed design solutions for both of those pathways. Next slide. So throughout the Climate Ready Dorchester planning process, we connected regularly with the Moakley Park team as well as the Bayside redevelopment team. So the Moakley Park berm that we've been talking about runs obviously through the park, and then really close to it, there's the Bayside redevelopment, which is thinking a lot about integrating flood protection, but there's this small gap. So what we need here is an integrated flood protection system, and we're thinking of essentially connecting the berm at Moakley Park to the Bayside redevelopment. So blocking off that flood pathway. And then kind of past the Bayside redevelopment, we have a raised harbor walk, which ties into high ground at the University of Massachusetts. So then if we zoom into the Morrissey pathway, next slide, you can see, so basically we presented, I don't know, is there a next slide, Carly?
Yeah, it doesn't look like there actually is. It goes straight into my presentation.
Okay, so the little box in the top left, the report essentially presents two options for this focus area of the neighborhood. One is looking at the raising of Morrissey Boulevard, and then the alternative, the less preferred option, is adding a harbor walk to the eastern edge of Morrissey to protect the neighborhood. Both options present a near-term and long-term solution at the Savin Hill and Patton Cove gap. So we have a near-term tide gate right underneath Morrissey, and then in the longer term, a berm kind of wrapping around the backside of Patton's Cove. Both options also have extended beach along Malibu Beach, as well as like a living shoreline element to work with some of that wave action and erosion. So that's briefly the plan and how it ties into Moakley. And I'll pass it back to you, Carly.
Thanks a lot, Peyton. So hello, everybody. I'm Carly Foster with Arcadis. And thanks, Amy and Boston Harbor Now for organizing this panel. You've all been hearing about some pretty incredible concepts and designs in flood risk resilience and coastal flood risk resilience. And I'm going to switch gears a little bit to talk about implementation. So last summer, we began working with the city stakeholders and the Boston Green Ribbon Commission to tackle some key questions about how the city could implement the significant coastal resilience actions that have been planned over the last 3 years and how that could be done in the absence of major federal funding, because we're not sure whether it would be available. So the results of that study are now published. They're on the Boston Green Ribbon Commission website, and the link to that is at the back of this presentation. It's called Expanding Boston's Capacity to Build Coastal Resilience Infrastructure, Lessons from the Seaport District. And it uses Climate Ready South Boston as sort of the study area. So this slide just sort of provides a refresh or recap on how busy the city's been over the course of the last 3 to 4 years. And so that study builds on the work that's been completed so far through Climate Ready Boston, through the district level plans, through various studies in finance and governance and guidelines that have been developed. The South Boston strategy was completed in 2018, and that was at the time the furthest along from a conceptual design perspective. And so we used parts of South Boston to see what opportunities existed to expedite implementation, as well as lessons learned that could be applied or not applied across other parts of the city. So I'm going to rewind just a little bit and talk about how you can embed implementation planning in the coastal resilience process from the very beginning of the project. It's Stephen Covey's concept of beginning with the end in mind. And I'll start just with this flood risk exposure map. And it tells multiple stories. By just looking at it, you can glean some key insights about what the implementation process or challenges could look like in this area. So the first thing that you probably see is that a lot of the map is blue, and a lot of the map is blue beginning pretty early in the century. So there's a lot of current flood risk that's demonstrated here. This is all to the 1% annual chance elevation. And then once you hit 9 inches of sea level rise, almost the entire Seaport District is covered in water. And then with 40 inches of sea level rise, that water begins flowing into the south end. So you know that there's urgent action, there's going to be widespread impact deeper in the city. And if you know the area, you also know that there's very little room. You can see it with the building overlay behind the flood hazard overlay, that a lot of the buildings are very close to the water, which means we don't have a lot of room to act, which could mean possible regulatory and permitting challenges. You also learn from this map that there is likely going to be needed action along the waterfront. There's not really much high ground to tie into, and there are properties right on the water. So if you're not willing to make changes at the waterfront, that means you have to sacrifice, you potentially have to sacrifice properties that are seaside from your solution. You can also glean from this map that you're probably going to be looking at a lot of funding needs because of the area, and that collective action will be needed because of the widespread overtopping right at the waterfront. So this concept that the property owners along the edge, and there are a lot of private property owners here specifically, are effectively going to have to link arms and form an unbroken chain in order to mitigate flooding. So if someone over here, for example, doesn't complete the chain, then eventually that flood water could pass across the neighborhood. So, you know, we talk a lot about engagement when we're developing solutions, and you know, our basic philosophy is that it needs to result in some change in all parties involved, educating, guiding, with various perspectives and the information that's shared. And when we're structuring engagement, we always ask these 4 questions: who could affect the project process, who could be affected by the process, who could affect project outcomes, and who could be affected by outcomes. And implementation is really relevant to all 4 of those, but especially question 3. And so we created focus groups related to critical issues that would need to be resolved for implementation. So I talked about collective action being needed across property owners. So we formed geographic focus groups so that the property owners could get to know one another and be part of the solution from the beginning of the planning process, building trust and understanding what possible impediments there might be, knowing that they're going to have designs that interconnect. Regulatory and permitting focus groups. I mentioned earlier that there was a potential for regulatory and permitting challenges just due to the basic structure of the area. And then, of course, funding and financing focus groups. So one of the other things that we did was prioritize, and when I say prioritize, what I really mean is time, implementation, of solutions across the area based on flood exposure and probability and how that was expected to evolve over time. And what you can see from this image, I think some of the colors may be a little bit difficult, but a huge portion of the solution for the overall neighborhood has to be done over the course of the next 10 or so years. And we're talking about $500 million to $1.5 billion worth of construction projects, depending on the alternative that is ultimately selected. Because the report, if you look up the Climate Ready Boston, South Boston report, you'll see that there were multiple alternatives presented for further refinement. And so in order to make that a little bit less daunting, there are 3 possible implementation tracks. There are partnerships that can be leveraged to implement the solutions neighborhood-wide, and they actually fall pretty neatly into various geographies. So and they can move forward in parallel. So track 1 is comprised mostly of private property owners, different property owners at even the parcel level marching up Fort Point Channel. Track 2 is dominated by Massport ownership and Massport tenants and maritime uses. And then track 3 is dominated by the state ownership and DCR. And track 4 is really about policies, programs, regulatory solutions to flood risk in the area. And this star is the area that is in Fort Point Channel. The 100 acres master plan was identified as extremely high priority due to its presence as a current flood pathway deeper into the city. And so the city has submitted, one of the recommendations was to submit a FEMA grant for that area, and that has been submitted and it is still under review. Here's a quick zoom into that area. And you can see that you can even kind of, based on flood risk, determine how you might do this on a step-by-step process at the parcel level, keeping in mind if you were going to do this kind of in a piecemeal fashion, that each of these properties have to be tied together to form an unbroken line of defense. So moving back into the study here, this really is a mapping of potential project capital and maintenance costs over time for South Boston only. And the message here, the main message is that the annual capital expenditure really begins to climb over the next couple years if we're going to keep on schedule to address the rising flood risk and sea level rise. So if sea level rise speeds up or slows down, that schedule can shift. So 2 of the highest risk neighborhoods, areas of the neighborhood are I'm wondering if everybody can see that when it keeps popping in. 2 of the highest risk areas in the neighborhood are along Fort Point Channel and Seaport Boulevard, and that's where we focused the study in coordination with the Green Ribbon Commission, with Bud Riss and John Cleveland. Were fantastic through that whole process. And the study was really 3-pronged in nature, using kind of desktop research, background analysis and research, literature reviews, case studies of how these things are being done in other parts of the country and globally, detailed investigations of various implementation and project delivery processes, engagement with, because we were focused on the most urgent action areas, we were focusing this on engagement of the folks that would have control over those properties, that we would need their buy-in in order to move forward. Also with city leadership and bouncing concepts off of the Green Ribbon Commission to see kind of how things would be interpreted and feasibility of different concepts. And then as we were moving through recommendation development, We focused on governance, funding, and policy recommendations. We also did an investigation into cost share analysis. So this concept of, who should be paying for what, when, how, and what could that look like? And we came up with a dual policy track framework, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. I won't go into the detail on all of these things. The study is available online. The interesting thing about implementation with coastal flood mitigation infrastructure is that it never really ends. And I think that that's really important to impart. The process might be different responsibilities, processes, funding sources, depending on where you are in the project development cycle, and an implementation strategy really needs to cover all of them. The reason I said it will never end is because the project will both have to be maintained through its entire life cycle, but also adapted to higher flood levels in the future with sea level rise. And that's really an interesting challenge to think about. Questions of implementation are also much more ethereal than questions of design. There aren't a lot of pictures to help one understand what we're talking about, or how to guide the conversation to make sure that we're all on the same page. So the project team devised the concept of spectrums to guide conversations about how people thought of implementation. So for example, where on the public to private spectrum should responsibility lie? It would be great to hear from folks in the chat box. It's responsibility for funding and maintenance of coastal flood protection infrastructure lie? Should funding for it be fair, as in you pay how much you benefit, for example, how much you pay is commensurate to what you the amount of flood risk reduction you experience, or should it be more equitable and take into consideration one's ability to pay? Should we be taking a site-by-site perspective or approach to all of these things, or be looking at them on a much more area-wide basis? Should governance be flexible, where folks, like it could be adapted over time, or more fixed? And should participation be voluntary or compulsory? And the answers to these questions could differ depending on where you're at. But this is what we use to help guide conversations in the area. We also have these key functions needed for successful implementation, and each of them have to be clearly assigned, staffed, resourced, with decision-making power and accountability aligned. So these are just a few of the key insights of the study. I'm just gonna highlight the middle three. There are more in the report, obviously, but it was really interesting to hear from property owners that they recognized, and perhaps it's no surprise with South Boston and the flood map that I showed you a little earlier, that they overwhelmingly recognized the need for collective action, collective governance and funding, and a solution that was both fair and equitable, taking into consideration both relative risk reduction and ability to pay. One of the things that we figured out pretty early on was it is possible, or likely possible, to deliver the most urgent projects, those planned for completion by 2025, along Fort Point Channel specifically, by simply maximizing the effectiveness of existing governance, regulatory, and funding approaches. But for the major projects that would be needed beyond that, there needs to be sort of more action taken, new or modified governance, funding, and regulatory approaches. And so that helped us come up with these implementation frameworks to deliver the most urgent projects on really a site-by-site basis. We didn't think that it would be possible to take widespread collective action to complete the most urgent projects by 2025. I mean, we're in 2020 already. And then track 2 would also begin immediately, but would be moving towards new frameworks and evolved approaches to help us implement the lion's share of the work that needs to be done. And we think a lot of the recommendations that are associated with track 2 are applicable to the rest of the city. And so these are just a couple example. I'm sorry?
Sorry, Carly, we're up on 340 right now.
Sure, no problem. We can move into questions if you'd like. The link to you can read the report at greenribboncommission.org, and it's quite detailed in terms of the implementation pathways that are recommended.
So I'm sorry, we're gonna have to wrap up, I think, without questions. Just for people that joined later, we are wrapping up at 3:40 because there is a moment of silence in honor of George Floyd at 3:45. So we want to give everyone the opportunity to participate in that. So on behalf of me and Boston Harbor Now and everyone that was involved organizing this, thank you, Amy, thank you, Julie, Carly, and Peyton. This was really great, and thank you all for joining and participating. I hope you'll join us for the final session today at 4. It's a town hall discussion with Secretary Katie Theohardis of the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. So thank you all. Yeah.
Thank you, Lily, and thanks to everyone for coming. We really appreciate your listening in.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks to